changing his mind. New details on the Iranian president's possible meeting with U.S. officials were at the White House. Primary challengers. A small number of Republicans are moving to run against President Donald Trump in 2020. Cardinal Pell update. Analysis of the Australian Church's leader's appeal of his conviction on child sexual abuse. And still standing. How thousands of crosses in Lithuania are inspiring the faithful and others. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, August 27th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. Iran's president backs away from a possible meeting with President Donald Trump. Hassan Rouhani says the U.S. must first lift crippling sanctions imposed on his country. President Trump wants to keep Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, and he hopes maximum pressure will bring Rouhani back to the negotiating table. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, believing it didn't go far enough to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. That move was opposed by allies and Iran. Now, President Trump wants a new deal, but even starting those discussions won't be easy.
A day after President Trump sounded optimistic about a possible meeting with Iran's President Hassan Rouhani,
I think he's going to want to meet. I think Iran wants to get this situation straightened out.
President Rouhani is indicating he's not interested in a photo op. Rouhani calls U.S. sanctions against Iran illegal, oppressive, and wrong. He insists they must be lifted or there will be no progress. President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal last year. He reimposed economic sanctions on the country, costing Iran billions of dollars in business deals. It's part of the president's maximum pressure campaign.
But we can't let them have a nuclear weapon. Can't let it happen.
Sina Tusi with the National Iranian-American Council believes the U.S. needs to relax some sanctions in order to get Iran back to the negotiating table.
I think a lot of this is kind of conditioned on Trump really offering tangible, credible incentives to Iran and not just the kind of photo op.
But Tusi says there is still room for hope.
If Trump actually did meet the Iranian president, perhaps at the UN General Assembly a couple of weeks from now, that would be a very positive development. It could be it could reduce these tensions that have taken us to the brink of war. It could be a stepping stone towards broader negotiations.
Iran's president has said he would be willing to meet if he knew it would help his country. There is no indication from President Trump that sanctions would be removed prior to any sort of meeting. Wyatt.
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. There are 435 days until the 2020 presidential election, and the large Democratic field continues to shrink. But there are new faces who want to face President Donald Trump in his own party. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi joins us with the latest. Jason?
Wyatt, neither of these two Republican challengers pose any real challenge to President Donald Trump. And some state Republican parties, like in South Carolina, are considering doing away with their primary next year, like they did in the past with President Reagan and President George W. Bush. The Republican National Committee has no plans for primary debate. Still, these Republican contenders say the time for change is now.
It's time to be brave.
Former one-term Republican Congressman Joe Walsh says it's time to run for president.
I have been waiting every single day this year for somebody to step up, a Republican to step up to make the moral case against him, that he is unfit.
Walsh hosts a conservative radio show, and he supported pro-life laws in Congress. Conservative Rachel Bovard says Walsh and his fellow GOP challenger Bill Weld have no chance.
President Trump has made pro-life priorities a signature of his first term. You're seeing, from a regulatory perspective, the most pro-life activity from any White House in the last 20 years. Congress has done very little, but President Trump has done a lot.
And President Trump brings up abortion on the campaign trail, as do his Democratic rivals.
It is your body. It is not the body of a politician in Washington or a state capital or a local government.
Democrats fight to win the liberal base, and two more moderate Democrats have left the race. But what will that mean next fall, when Democrats need to win moderate votes?
they are losing their moderate base. And I think you find a lot of moderate Democrats who are simply saying, I don't recognize my own party anymore. And they are going to have to deal with that, as you point out, in the general, when they're going to have to, it's going to be incumbent upon them to recapture those voters and sort of swing from the far left to the middle. And to be honest, I don't know if they can.
In fact, yesterday's Monmouth University poll found the frontrunners in the Democratic primary are Senators Elizabeth Warren and Senators Bernie Sanders. Just behind them at 19%, the former Vice President Joe Biden. Now, Democrats will debate in just about 2.5 weeks, and the requirements for that debate are a little bit stricter. Only 10 Democrats have made the cut. Wyatt?
Correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. A judge in Oklahoma rules Johnson & Johnson helped fuel the state's opioid crisis and ordered the company to pay more than $500 million.
The opioid crisis has ravaged the state of Oklahoma. It must be abated immediately. For this reason, I am entering an abatement plan that consists of costs totaling $572,102,028.
The landmark verdict comes after a 7-week trial. Johnson & Johnson says it will appeal. Dozens of states are suing opioid drug makers. The case in Oklahoma was the first to reach trial. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has changed its rules against guns in places of worship. The new measure now prohibits all lethal weapons inside Mormon churches. Previously, members were discouraged from taking their guns to church. The new policy includes an exception for law enforcement officials. Federal officials say the suspect in the Pittsburgh synagogue massacre should face the death penalty if convicted. 11 people were murdered in the Tree of Life synagogue last October. The suspect has pleaded not guilty and is awaiting trial, but the wife of one of those killed in the attack says she is not in favor of the death penalty. She tells the New York Times, "I just don't see that justice is being served by doing this." Firefighters are struggling to control the blaze in the Amazon region of Brazil. But earlier today, the president of Brazil, seen on the right, said he would accept an offer of international aid only if France's leader apologizes. Jair Bolsonaro says Emmanuel Macron called him a liar. The G7 countries, including France, pledged $20 million to fight the disaster. Muslim clerics in Sri Lanka are asking their government if the country's ban on face veils has been officially lifted. Veils have been forbidden under an emergency rule following a series of suicide bombing attacks targeting hotels and churches in April, but the emergency declaration recently ended. More deadly violence in Syria today as rebels and government forces clash. More than 50 fighters on both sides were killed. The ongoing civil war in Syria started in 2011. The violence has displaced more than 500,000 civilians, according to the United Nations. Christians in the country suffer persecution, and many have fled. Alessandro Monteduro is director of Aid to the Church in Need in Italy. The group is dedicated to helping persecuted Christians around the world. Alessandro, what is the situation like for Christians living in Syria today, and what are you hearing from church leaders on the ground?
The same terrorism has yet to be defeated. As a result, for our brothers in the faith, for the Christians, the same Christians have more need of our aid than ever. And so we know a lot of situations in which Christian families are living a desperate situation. As Aid to the Church in Need, we are trying, but not only today, in the last 8 years of war, to help them bringing food, medicine, water, electricity, obviously the humanitarian aid. The situation is currently desperate, and the impression is that there isn't sufficient awareness.
You had mentioned all the work that your group is doing. In December, Aid to the Church in Need launched a project to help raise awareness about children in Syria. Have you seen any improvement on the international level when it comes to raising the awareness of Christian persecution in Syria?
Obviously, for me, it's ironic, the reaction, but for instance, checking the agenda of the G7 a few days ago, I didn't find any attention for Syria, for the war in Syria, for the effects of the same war in Syria. At the same time, in the last 18 months, it's like the drama of Christians and of the war in the same region is disappeared of the most important newspapers of the Western countries. And so as a result, for EWTN Church Need and for all the charities, Catholic charities above all, now the challenge is to contrast from a point of view the indifference of the Western countries, of the Western societies, but at the same time to contrast the resignation of the Syrian people who are feeling this sensation of abandonment. And it isn't easy as you can understand, but this is our challenge in front of us. It has been the challenge in these years, and it's now more than in the past.
Yes, it's why your work is so important. Earlier this month, Pope Francis blessed 6,000 rosaries for a campaign you're organizing to show solidarity with Christians in Syria. You recently met with the Holy Father when he blessed the rosaries. What role is the Vatican playing in trying to bring peace in Syria?
Pope is a giant of our time, maybe or better, certainly is the only leader all over the world who are still appealing for the sufferances of the Syrian people and especially of the Christians. And so for us and for EWTN Church Need is really also the occasion to express our gratitude for the sensibility of the same Pope. When I met a few days ago Pope Francis, I have to say, I spotted, but all EWTN Church Need spotted the closeness, the love, the interest for our projects and the participation by the same Pope for the sufferances of Christians. Anyway, now for us it's very important, and the rosaries from this point of view is another moment in which we are going in Syria distributing these rosaries, 6,000 rosaries for all the families who suffered the persecution more than other.
Such an important reminder for us to continue to pray for all of those Christians in Syria and so many people who continue to suffer. And obviously we pray that God will continue to bless the work that you guys are doing. Alessandro Monteduro, Director of Aid to the Church in Need in Italy, thanks very much for talking with us.
Thanks a lot.
Coming up, Pope Francis delivers a message to young people in Paraguay, and how and why Cardinal Pell will appeal his conviction on child sexual abuse. Pope Francis tells young people in Paraguay to bring the gospel to the needy and disadvantaged. His message came at the end of a 3-year initiative dedicated to the South American country's youth. The Holy Father also reminded them they are called to be friends with Jesus Christ, and if they remain in Him, they will bear much fruit. Sources close to Cardinal George Pell tell our partners at Catholic News Agency that he will appeal his conviction to the Australian High Court. This would be the Cardinal's final appeal. Last week, an Australian appeals court upheld Cardinal Pell's conviction for child sexual abuse. The former Vatican official has maintained his innocence. Join me now with his analysis is Edward Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency. Ed, welcome back in. What is the basis for Cardinal Pell's new appeal, and how likely is it that the Australian High Court is going to accept this case?
Well, the Court of Appeals that denied his appeal at the first level that he had has granted leave to appeal, and he's gone to the High Court in Canberra seeking leave to appeal on the one ground left, which is that the jury's conviction of him was unreasonable, that basically 12 reasonable people could not look at the evidence that was presented during his trial and say there was no reasonable doubt of his guilt. Now, many people have noted that the High Court doesn't have a particularly strong record in hearing special leave to appeal cases, that they tend not to take them unless they're of compelling national interest, although in this case, Pell certainly is. It's split the community in Australia, it's split the legal community, it's occasioned real international interest. At the same time, Cardinal Pell has maintained his innocence, and he has a dissenting opinion from the appellate court, really laying out what many are calling a very compelling fact pattern for what was wrong with the jury's original decision.
Any sense of a timeline here if the High Court decides to take it up?
Well, if they take it, we would expect to hear in the next few months. It's likely that it would be heard sometime in the middle of next year. So in the meantime, Cardinal Pell is almost certain, barring unforeseen circumstances, to remain in prison at least for the next year, year and a half.
So the Vatican, of course, is carrying out its own investigation against Cardinal Pell. How does any of this, or does any of this affect the Vatican's investigation?
Absolutely. It's a hard pause on everything going on in Rome. The Vatican's been very clear from the beginning that as long as Cardinal Pell is still involved in the civil process in Australia, nothing is proceeding with the canonical trial, that they're going to let that run its course first. They've noted that Pell maintains his innocence, and they want to see where Australian justice lands. Now, as soon as that's over, there will be a canonical trial in Rome for all of these charges related to Pell, and how that will play out, I think, will depend a great deal on what kind of evidence is able to be discovered and brought out of the criminal procedures that he's gone through.
Cardinal Pell is 78 years old. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. What have conditions been like for him?
Well, he's spent most of his time so far in solitary confinement, and I think this is likely to remain the case. Prisoners the world over who are in jail following sexual abuse of minors charges tend to be kept isolated almost for their own safety more than anything else. More distressingly for the Cardinal, I think, is that he's not able to say Mass. The Australian Justice Department have confirmed that prisoners are not permitted to lead religious services. They don't have access to alcohol, including sacramental wine. And so he's really living this as a time of what one person close to him described to me as a monastic prayer, that he's treating it that way.
Do we have any sense of when he might be eligible to appeal or to apply for parole?
He's eligible for parole 3 years into his 6-year sentence, so we'd be still looking at more than another 2.5 years.
Okay. So this case, you'd mentioned before, is met with mixed reactions. There are those who believe he's guilty, those who believe he's innocent. Have you ever seen a case like this, Ed, where involving a top Catholic cleric like this that has been so divisive?
I think this one's really captured the attention of the world because of Pell's high profile before he moved to the Vatican and served as Pope Francis's sort of financial reform chief. It's really hard to think of anyone who measures up to that. We have, of course, had the recent example of former Cardinal, former Archbishop Theodore McCarrick, who I think is really the only obvious parallel in terms of stature, although a very, very different fact pattern there. And I think you're looking at a very inexact comparison in terms of what they've been accused of over what time period and with what body of evidence.
Okay, well, such an important case. Obviously, we'll continue to follow this, see if the Australian High Court takes it up. Edward Condon, D.C. Bureau Chief for Catholic News Agency. Thanks so much.
Pleasure.
Up next, we'll show you 200,000 crosses on a hill in Lithuania. A federal judge this afternoon blocked Missouri's 8-week abortion ban. The measure is on hold while it plays out in court. Planned Parenthood and the ACLU have filed suits against the measure, saying it's unconstitutional. The law also bans abortion for a diagnosis of Down syndrome. It was set to take effect tomorrow. A Christian business owner is defending his choice not to print custom shirts for a gay pride festival. He's now waiting for a decision from Kentucky's Supreme Court.
I will work with any person, no matter who they are and no matter what their belief systems are. But when I'm presented with a message that conflicts with my faith, that's just something I cannot print. That's the line for me.
Blaine Adamson, owner of the Lexington-based print shop Hands On Originals, was originally sued in 2012. The case has been in and out of Kentucky courts for the past 7 years. Joining me now from Phoenix, Arizona is Ryan Tucker, Senior Counsel with Alliance Defending Freedom. ADF represents Blaine Adamson in this case. Ryan, welcome in. This is a case that, as I mentioned, has been in courts for 7 years. Why has it now reached the level of the Kentucky Supreme Court?
Well, I think in part that's probably the slow wheels of justice. Blaine's been fortunate enough to prevail at the 2 lower courts, but it's taken that amount of time to reach all the way to the Kentucky Supreme Court.
So what punishment is Mr. Adamson facing if the court rules against him?
Well, these laws vary depending on jurisdiction, but in Blaine's case, the commission, the Human Rights Commission that filed this complaint, asked him to provide diversity training to his staff. And so that would require him to subject people that he works with to whatever training it is that the local government wanted him to provide.
One of the interesting...
But fortunately, obviously in this instance, he prevailed.
Right. Well, one of the interesting things about this case that you guys have noted with ADF is that it's a government commission that's actually spearheading this lawsuit. Explain what's going on.
Yeah, so if we go back a bit, I know it was referenced in the introduction, but in 2012, Blaine Adamson was faced with a question. He was asked to print a T-shirt that was going to promote a local gay festival, gay pride festival. And rather than print that T-shirt, he respectfully declined and instead told the individual that he'd be more than happy to connect that individual with another printer locally. But that simply wasn't enough. Instead, the individual filed a complaint with a local human rights commission, and there are a number of these across the United States. And that commission then proceeded to prosecute the claim against Mr. Adamson and his company.
So now when you think about that, when you think about this case and think about how long it's been in courts, what has this process been like for Blaine personally over these last 7 years?
You know, he was asked that question last Friday. I was present for it, and he gave an amazing answer, one that I can't do justice. But obviously, anyone that's involved in a 7-year legal battle, that takes its toll. But as Blaine mentioned, the question is not really whether it's worth it; it was whether he had to do it. And thankfully, Blaine stood on his principles and has fought the good fight. And we've won at the last two lower courts, and we're expecting a great victory here at the Kentucky Supreme Court.
I want to give you a chance to respond to your opponents who argue that in not printing the T-shirt, Blaine was practicing censorship. So how do you think, first off, how do you respond to that? But also, how do you think we balance matters of free speech with the freedom of religion?
Well, sure. You know, first off, Blaine serves everyone. He just can't print all messages. Yeah, I think Blaine mentioned at the beginning on the clip, and that's how he lives. That's how he does his business, and it's not about the person; it's about the message that he's being asked to provide. And I think that's a fundamental First Amendment right that we all have, and this case should be concerning for everyone. And a victory from Blaine is really a victory for everyone, regardless of whether they believe with his religious beliefs or not.
Okay, well, it's such an interesting case and obviously has repercussions as we're watching similar cases across the country. Ryan Tucker, Senior Counsel with Alliance Defending Freedom. Thanks so much for explaining it to us today.
Thank you for having me.
Finally tonight, a collection of more than 200,000 crosses and crucifixes erected on a hill in the Lithuanian countryside is serving as a retreat for locals and visitors. The pilgrimage site has a complex history, and it's become a symbol of defiance after surviving several attempts to destroy it.
This place is a symbol of, about the faith.
Lost in the Lithuanian countryside in the north of the country, hundreds of thousands of crosses have elevated a simple mound into a symbol of resistance in the face of the brutal occupation this Baltic country has faced over the centuries. Crosses of all sizes have been erected on the hill. The first were put up back in 1863. The number of crosses grew fast, despite several attempts over the years to destroy the site by the Communist Party. Today, about 200,000 of them can be found. Simas Dogmatis is a tour guide who volunteers on the hill.
This place was destroyed for 5 times maybe, and it was rebuilt all the time, every time it was rebuilt.
Today, the Hill of Crosses has become an important place for the faithful, and also for tourists who come from afar.
I feel really overwhelmed by it's beautiful, because I have heard about the history and stuff, so it's definitely impressive.
In 1993, Pope John Paul II visited Lithuania and held Mass at the Hill. 100,000 people gathered. 25 years later, 250,000 people travel to this remote part of the Lithuanian countryside each year.
It's a magic place that people can go to, even though there is hard times. They have something to cling to.
And it's a reminder to all of us how blessed we are to be in this country and how important it is to stand up for our faith. And that wraps up our newscast for tonight. We thank you for watching. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We'll be back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.